Welcome back to Gary's Economics. Today we're going to explain why rent, profits and interest are all the same thing. Alright, so I wanted to bring it back to basics and do a nice educational video that is going to help you to understand the way the economy works. Now, I've always considered rent, profits and interest to be basically transformations of the same thing. But I don't think many people think of them in that way. So I want to explain why I think this, and I think it's going to help you explain basically the structure of our economy. Now, the first thing to say is the title is not to be taken exactly literally, of course. There are important differences between rent, profits and interests, and we're going to explain them in more detail in this video. But in a very real important sense, these three things are all the same thing. And the way they can basically be described is all three, rent, profits and interests, are payments that are made by poorer people, the non-owners of assets, to richer people, the owners of assets, in order to use those assets. And I think the best way to explain how that works is to go through an example. So let's say I've got £500,000 and you are a person who has nowhere to live and you need somewhere to live. So you come to me and you say, all right, Gary, I've got nowhere to live. You've got £500,000. Can you help me to get a house to live in? We can do this and we can structure this in three different ways. So number one, the most obvious way is I use that £500,000 to buy a house. I rent that house to you. This is the classic landlord-tenant relationship. I buy the house, I rent it to you, you pay me 25 grand a year rent. Number one, rents. The second way we can do it is I lend you the money, I lend you the £500,000, you buy the house, and then you pay me £25,000 interest every year in order to live in the house. So now you're paying 25 grand, same amount, but in interest. And the third way that we can structure this is I set up a company, I use the company to buy a house, you live in the house, you pay 25 grand a year rent to the company, that company makes 25 grand a year profit and it pays it to me in dividends. So in all three of these cases, I use my £500,000 to buy a house, I'm allowing you to live in that house and you are paying me 25 grand a year to live in the house. But in situation one, I receive rent. In situation number two, I receive interest. And in situation number three, I receive dividends from profits. So you see, from the perspective of me, as a wealthy person, as an investor, once I have a certain amount of wealth, I can buy, in this case, the exact same asset, the exact same house, in three different ways. And the financial structure I choose around that purchase basically determines whether I receive rent, interest or dividends. So for me as an investor, they're basically the same thing. I have £500,000, I want to receive some sort of passive income stream, and I can choose what to do. And for me, it's really easy to transfer between the two. So let's say I chose the third option and I bought the house in a company. Eventually I'm thinking, okay, the structure of a company is not working for me. I'm going to collapse the company. I'm going to take direct ownership of the property. Now I'm receiving rent directly. Say I don't want to receive rent anymore. I want to start receiving interest. Okay, well, I sell the house. I buy government bonds. Now I'm receiving interest from the government. I can sell those government bonds and I can buy mortgage bonds. Now I'm receiving, again, your mortgage interest payments for the house. That's not working for me. I sell it. I buy the stock market. Now I'm receiving company profits. So from the perspective of the individual, it's super easy to transfer between these things. And I think ordinary people don't tend to realize that basically, once you are a wealthy person, you own a certain amount of assets. Even by buying just the same asset, you can choose to receive rent, interest, dividends, which is profit. They're basically the same thing. And in all three cases, that cash flow, many people describe these cash flows on the internet as passive income. In all three cases, it's not really passive income. It's money that comes from you. I own the house, you live in the house, and you're paying me your salary to live in the house. And this is basically what all of these things are. These are payments made by you, a poorer person who does not have assets, to me, a rich person who has assets, in order to use those assets. And it goes a lot beyond housing. Let's say you book a flight, you go to Portugal with EasyJet, or you go to the barber. Let's take the flight situation. You need a plane. So as a very wealthy person, I could own a plane and I could rent it to EasyJet, and part of your ticket will go towards that rental of the plane, which goes to me. Or I could buy EasyJet stock. Part of your ticket price goes towards EasyJet profits, which comes to me. Or I could lend money to EasyJet, in which case part of your ticket goes to interest payments, again, to me. So once again, when you buy this ticket, some of that money is going to me as the owner of the assets. If you go to the barber, somebody owns that barber shop, and it could be that the barber is paying rent to the owner of the property, or it could be that the owner has taken a loan to buy that property and is paying interest to use the property, or it could be that that barber is part of a big barber corporation and all of those properties are owned by the shareholders and they receive the profits. So in both cases, whether you take in a plane, living in a house, going to get your hair cut, you are paying some amount of money to the owners of the physical assets that are being used. The owners receive that in either profits, interest, or rent directly. And this is even the case with, the other basic essentials that you need. When you buy food, a big chunk of that goes towards the owners of the farmland. And again, that could take any one of these forms. When you use energy to heat your home, a big part of that money goes towards the owners of the energy production infrastructure in our country. Now, I want to talk a little bit about a couple big exceptions, because I know there's going to be people out there that say, listen, if I buy a property with a mortgage, that's totally different from renting, right? Renting is money down the drain. If I buy a house with a mortgage, I can pay the mortgage off over time. I'm building up equity in my house over time. These two things are totally different. And from one perspective, that is totally true, right? If you as an individual rent a house, you are not the legal owner of the house. But if you take a mortgage and buy the house, you are the legal owner of the house. But, let's go back to my example, right? Let's assume I've used £500,000 to buy a property and rent it to my sister. She pays 25 grand a year rent. If I lend 500 grand to my sister, she buys the property, she pays 25 grand interest. Assuming she doesn't make any extra payments above the interest, in both cases, financially, her situation is exactly the same, basically. She pays 25 grand a year rent, or she pays 25 grand a year interest. So financially, there's no difference between these two things. But there is one very big, important technical difference between buying with a mortgage and renting, which is who bears the risk of changes in the price, changes in the value. And I think this is the reason why people in this country are so keen on buying with mortgages. So if you rent and the price of the property goes up, you are unaffected, you don't own the property. But if you buy with a mortgage and the price of the property goes up, you take the profit, basically. You take the upward movement in price. And of course, in the last 30, 40 years, house prices in this country and in most countries in the world have gone very aggressively up with only a few sort of downwards hiccups, which means that if you as an individual have chosen to buy with a mortgage, you would have done massively better than if you have chosen to rent over the last 40 years. But I think it's important to realize the only real reason that people who've used mortgages and paid interest rather than people who have rented and paid rent have done better is basically because prices have gone up really aggressively. If prices hadn't gone up really aggressively, you'd be in pretty much the exact same situation. And I think it's worth also recognizing that if prices had gone down, people who had bought with mortgages would have been totally screwed. If you buy a property with a big mortgage, the price goes down, you can become bankrupted extremely quickly. This is what happened in Japan in the early 90s when the housing market popped. There was an enormous number of people immediately bankrupted. But I think it's important to say, I've said many times on this channel, I think house prices will continue to go up. So I'm not saying you shouldn't buy with mortgages. But it's important to recognize that both ways of doing it, buying with a mortgage or renting, you will pay an enormous amount of either rent or interest to either the guy who provided the loan or the owner of the house, which is essentially the same thing. There's no way of getting out of it. If you do not own any wealth and you want to live in a house, you will pay these huge amounts of passive income either way, using a mortgage or using rent. The only difference is in one case, you bear the price risk, which is good if prices go up, and they probably will, but terrible if prices go down. And the other way, you don't. So I think the reason that this is important to understand, that rent, interest, and profits are the same thing, is because it helps us to recognize that underneath these enormous amount of different cash flows, which can take different names, There exists a real country with real things. There are real houses, real commercial buildings, there is real farmland, there are real natural resources. And every time you use those things, every time you live in a house, every time you eat food, every time you use energy, you are paying money to the owners of those natural resources. And whether it's called profits, whether it's called interest, or whether it's called rent, it's always the same thing, basically. You as an individual without wealth have to pay money to the individuals who own the assets in order to basically live your life. And this is essentially why it's kind of inevitable that unless you take some sort of preventative measures, wealth inequality will and does tend to get higher over time. And that's because, you as an individual, you have an income of 30, 40, 50 grand a year. You spend the vast majority of that on living in a house, eating food, using energy, other essential costs. And your salary goes in the form of profit, interest, rents to the owners of the assets. So after you've paid your essential costs, you only may be making, 10, 15 grand a year if you're lucky. And the rest of your money has gone to the owners of the assets. So there's this massive constant drive of cash from the non-owners of assets, less rich people, to the owners of assets, richer people. And while that is happening, these guys accumulate money, which they will inevitably use to buy the rest of the assets. So to conclude, one of the big reasons I wanted to bring this up is because I wanted people to realize that because rent and interest are in many ways the same thing, owning property but with increasingly enormous amounts of debt is very similar to not owning properties at all. And the reason why it's important that you understand this is generationally in this country, whilst there is still a sort of big middle class of property owners, those property owners are increasingly needing larger and larger amounts of debt in order to own the properties. So if we consider my granddad's generation, by 40, in many cases, they would have paid off the majority of their mortgage and be close to owning their property. Whereas my dad's generation would probably be about halfway there by 40. And my generation will, in many cases, still having 90 or 80% mortgages by the time they're 40, because they will, in many cases, have only just bought. And I think this ties in nicely to the video from last week where we spoke about the illusion of improvement and the way that individuals, when they focus narrowly on their own financial situation, may feel that they're improving, whereas generationally their family is getting poorer over time. So individuals who own their own property with a mortgage, they will be slowly paying their debt down, and they will often feel like, I'm doing well, I'm getting richer, without realizing that their children and grandchildren are in a much worse situation, largely because of the much higher property prices, and will need to have much higher levels of debt. So even though you as an individual are becoming less indebted over time, you as a family are becoming more indebted over time. This is really important to understand. It's happening to our governments as well. Governments are increasingly going in debt to the rich, paying large amounts of interest to the rich. Families are doing the same thing. This is a big way that we lose our middle class and our country falls into poverty. So you need to be aware, you need to understand interest, rent, profits, all the same thing. Payments made from poor people to rich people that make wealth inequality get higher. We're going to keep talking about it to help you understand it. Thank you very much.